I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Kyle and I are way overdue to podcast. We made plans to podcast before and never did it. But this book has been sitting on my shelf for a long time, and I don't know why I never picked it up and read it, because it's like Kyle designed this book for my brain. Boris Says the Words by Kyle Winkler is the book we're going to be talking about. Kyle, before we get into the book, let's talk about where you come from. What's your background? How did you get into writing science fiction and all that?
Okay, yeah. So I'm from, like you, Indiana. I'm from Southwest Indiana. So I'm from Vincennes, which is on the Wabash River. It's a little college town. It's a small place, man. I grew up there. I lived a little bit in Indianapolis for a couple of years, but came back. So I'm mostly from a rural part of Indiana. I didn't have a large connection to what's the word I'm looking for? Like fandom.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like as an adult, I've realized that there was a whole thing going on in the background called fandom. There were cons that people went to, and people were sharing things on forums and newsletters and zines, and there was this whole world out there that I was just absolutely lost to. I did not know anything was there, but one thing that kind of kept me through, one thing that I latched onto very early was Star Trek, TNG, and I was in probably third, fourth grade. I would watch that in reruns after school, play it at school. I'm in my early 40s, so this is early 90s, recess, whatever, and then started drawing ships. And then my dad started buying me the Star Trek novels, but I don't think I had one by Peter David, but those types. And I'd read those. I love those. And
probably the John Ordover era of was probably the editor at that time.
Yeah, these are pocket. I mean, this was the TNG version, so they were like Debtor's Planet, and that was the one. That was the first one I got by W.R. Thompson. I remember. I still have it somewhere, I think.
Well, John came on this podcast in his robe once, so
there you go. I'm making connections. This is great. So I did basically that was what got me into SF, the Star Trek. And I would always, my dad was an early adopter because of his friends were early adopters of technology, especially PCs and Macs. So my dad had a Macintosh 2, I think, pretty early on. And he used that to like keep his books or something, like he did it for like accounting. It was a Quicken. It's like the first Quicken program I think he had on there. So. But I would use the the word processor, and I would type stories. I was obsessed with James Bond novels. I read all the John Gardner novels, right? So I was typing James Bond stories and Star Trek stories and coming up with all kinds of stuff. And they would last one page or something, and nothing would ever happen to them. But I was always kind of writing like elementary school, off and on, and. Well, again, the reason why I mentioned fandom is because no one was reinforcing the whole thing of like, oh, you like this stuff and you write this stuff. It was always just, I just did it, and I couldn't share it with anybody because none of my friends liked it, right? So it wasn't until I was probably in college I started realizing that there were other people who liked it, and there were these communities, and then I started really investing in having that background or that personality And now with social media, it's like it's so easy to do that. Now I found my crew, I found my people. So um, Philip K. Dick was, just because we're mentioning, because we're so tied to that, both of us, that came around relatively, maybe I say late. I think I started, the first PKD I read was Valis, and I was a freshman in college. And I remember thinking, what the fuck is this? But I loved it because it was weird and it was short, and he was doing all the kind of stuff I was already wanting to do, like translating his name into horse leather fat, like through other different languages. That was, I thought that was like the coolest, most hilarious thing, because I was also reading Pynchon, so I came through this whole like Pynchon train. I was like, I started learning about weird '60s new wave SF through being on the Pynchon waste list. I don't know if you know what that is. It's like the online newsletter. So I was just always absorbing and reading critical theory way before I was prepared for it, and absorbing. So I always saw his name and always all these references to him and all the things he was doing, but had never read it. So, but
well,
and then,
so was
yeah.
PKD the first like real science fiction writer that you kind of clung onto, or did you find a couple before then?
I mean, oh man, I'm trying to think like, yeah, outside of like a property thing like Star Trek, and I don't consider Pynchon an SF writer. Probably one of the first that I read that's like still in that pantheon that you can look back and go, yes, this is part of an SF tradition, was probably Dick.
Yeah.
I think I probably had read some Bradbury. I know I read some Bradbury and Asimov stories in school, as you're wont to do, for like fifth grade English, sixth grade English or something. You'd read like those little 2-3 page stories. But again, I didn't understand where they slotted in the history of the field. I had no clue, right? So,
well, and I was myself. I was early interested in this stuff from a young age. So I my first attempts at reading PKD were way before I could get it. And so I think freshman in college is actually a great time for you to discover that. And because my first attempts at reading PKD were certainly before I was ready, although it was really Total Recall more so than Blade Runner that for me like kind of sent me in the direction of PKD. But at the same time, I mean, I was reading Asimov and Heinlein when I was super young. So
yeah,
I had that whole path. But okay, so you're in college. So I mean, have you been taking writing? You were writing little stories when you were
when I was little, right? But writing did not become a real thing until I got into college, right around the time I was reading Dick. I'm not going to give him the credit for this because I was still very much invested in what is foolishly called literary fiction, quote unquote, or realist fiction. And I remember I got to college. I was like, I don't know. I was going to a community college in my town for the first couple of years. And I was like, I want any major where I can just read books. What major is that? And they're like, well, English. And I was like, do it. Let's go. And I remember taking a creative writing class. I was really invested in it. My teacher really supported me, let me know that I had talent of some kind. And I look back on what I wrote, it was like trash, obviously, but at the time there was something there. And then when I made the leap to go to Ball State to finish, I graduated and then finished my undergraduate at Ball State, which is in Muncie, Indiana. I was like, I'm
my
going to do
wife
creative
went to
writing.
Ball State, so you're not teaching me anything. I don't know.
No, for people out there who don't know, because when I mention it, people don't know. So,
Hudsucker Proxy, right?
The Hudsucker Proxy, yeah. If you've seen that, Muncie, Indiana, right? Yeah.
He's a Muncie gal.
It's a Muncie gal. I love that movie. I met my wife at Ball State, so yeah. There was the only undergraduate in Indiana at the time that had a creative writing major. IU did not have an undergraduate creative writing major at the time,
Yeah.
because I probably would have gone to IU. Ball State was the only one, so I went to Ball State. And after that, the people there were sort of like, well, if you want to keep going on, you got to get an MFA. I took a year off, went home, worked for a newspaper. I did tutoring. I did substitute teaching. I was working constantly on one story that I was going to turn in for my MFA. Applied to 8, got into 2, OSU and WashU, and decided to go to WashU, literally just because it was more fancy. Also because they didn't require the GRE, which I thought was pretty great. And did my MFA there. I worked with Catherine Davis. Some people might know as sort of a well-known, I call her, I don't know, she's her own thing, but she's a fantasist for sure. She writes things that are irreal. And Laura Miller in Slate magazine a few years ago called her the greatest underappreciated American writer of our current era, which I found to be probably true. And a couple of other people. Read a lot of Dick there, read a lot more SF there, was much more feeling the whole fantasy, magical realism, all the other stuff that was going on there. And then just kept working. And I started the seed of Boris after my second year. I was there for an extra year teaching. I was living in a converted synagogue with a buddy of mine in Tower Grove, a neighborhood of St. Louis. And I started this, it was going to be a story, then it became a novella. And the novella just kept expanding into a full novel over the years.
Do you consider this your first novel?
Yes, this is the first finished book that I wrote, but it's not the first thing I've written. So I probably started and didn't finish 8 novels before this.
Okay.
But this book was the first one that I wrote and finished, and then tried to send out to agents and got feedback on. And you wrote a really lovely laudatory review for this novel, Taylor, which I really appreciate deeply. And you made comment twice that this is a book that went over the heads of publishing. And you're right. And there's also a little bit that's not totally correct there, but it's mostly right. It's that when this novel was,
well,
at its
my
most
dude,
polished,
they did not swoop it up. It went.
I know. Well, let me say. So I want people to think about this, and it's not going to be a new story to you, and maybe some of the listeners, but I still think it's worth telling. Is that this book was probably, when I had it and it was done, and I sent it out to a couple of agents. Right, it was like 2010 or something, and nothing came back. It was like, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, or whatever. And there was no like, we want to see more pages or anything. And then I got into a PhD program at Pittsburgh, and I stopped writing for 3 years. I did nothing because I was working on a PhD. We had a baby. Life took over. It was just not going to happen. And then I suddenly realized, I was like, why am I not doing anything with this? So I went back, looked at it again, revised it. It was now a mature novel. It wasn't just like the first thing I'd ever finished. And I took it and sent it to a friend of mine's agent with his blessing. And it was PJ Mark at Jen Clone Nesbitt, who's a big agent. He's done some things. So I was really sort of excited. He was like, yeah. He's like, I want to see more. I gave him the full thing. He was like, let's talk. So we talked on the phone, and we had this whole back and forth, and he gave me some notes, and I said, okay, I'm going to work on it. And I think back on this now, I took a year to work on this, which is absolutely stupid. Why did I take a year to do this? I changed the book. I changed it into this other form to like sort of meet the expectation of what this guy wanted. And I gave it back to him. He read it. He went, no, I don't want it.
Right.
And I was like, what? I was like, it made no sense. I don't understand how that happened. Long story short, I ended up working with his assistant, who became his own agent down the road, for Grass Hands, which was another one of my books, which didn't end up getting picked up by anybody either. But this just was, I was like, well, what do I do with this novel now? And both were like, well, you just put it aside. You have to work on something else. And I thought that was really stupid, because the books that you write that don't get picked up by publishing don't then become outcasts. They need to be published, if they're, and so I just was like waiting. And when publishing failed me after 3 novels that went on sub. Yeah, almost, yeah. I took this wasn't the first book I published on my own. That was The Nothing That Is, and my short story collection was second. But I did this because I thought this will find readers somewhere, and of course, it did. And I wrote in the back a really sort of like cutting, for everybody who said they didn't know what to do with this. Well, don't worry, I found something to do with it.
Right. And I wasn't entirely reacting to that in the afterword, but what I'm reacting to in a sense is that for me, this is a brilliant piece of work. And if the readers, if the editors and agents and people who read it had got it, if it hadn't sailed over their heads, they would have found a home for it. They would have found a way to get it out there. Now, that being said, I'm a fucking weirdo, and this book is like primed for me in lots of really weird ways, beyond the fact that the writer is from Southern Indiana and I'm from Southern Indiana. I'm a huge dickhead, and The Sheep Look Up by John Brunner is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yep.
And it's clearly an influence on this book in a sense, but it's not the same kind of story. It's much more character driven than for example Bruner would do, but or Bruner did in that particular case. But it hits a lot. It hits a lot of my nails, right?
Yeah.
And I acknowledge that. That being said, I've been through the situation too. The thing is that these agents and people, they read a lot of work, and they've got there's tons of people submitting things to them, and it may be hard for them to understand how certain books match up. We have the situation, Anthony and I, my longtime Dickheads co-host Anthony, we wrote a novel called Nightmare City that we put on sub all over the place, and we spent a lot of time doing it. Eventually went with an indie publisher because to us it was more important that the IP exists out there, because we also have television script version of it. And so we made that choice. And we had the situation where we had agents who would read it and tell us it was good, but they didn't know how to market it, or because we were a team and they didn't know how to do that. And then at one point we had one agent who was super into it, and then George Floyd happened, and the novel became too close to home, where he was like, I can't live in this world, because this novel that we'd written, we were pitching it as The Wire if Clive Barker and Philip K. Dick were on the writing staff, right?
Oh my God.
And hey, it's out there. You can buy it, Nightmare City. So we eventually just published it like with an indie publisher, knowing 10 people would probably see it, because we're still trying to pitch it as a TV show or, an ongoing series. And for us, it was like, well, let's get that IP into circulation. But my point is, and I told this long story, is I understood exactly what you were saying. I could almost envision all these discussions over email that you're having about this book, right?
Yeah.
Because I see it. But that being said, this book is, and look, I'm normally a huge believer in gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Like, I actually believe that a book has to go through the process in order, because I've read a lot of self-published. Read a lot of self-published.
Me too.
Yeah. And this book is an argument for the democratization of publishing, because you did the hard work. This is a highly literate book. It's well edited. It's well designed. It looks better than many like books from like fucking HarperCollins.
That's a high compliment. I laid out the interior of the book myself. This is the only book that I did the interior of.
Yeah.
The cover was done by one of my brother's friends from childhood, still a friend, Ryan Dunn, who's is a professional graphic designer, but on the side does mostly like punk band album covers. He's now starting to do stuff for really big artists. I don't listen to this guy, but people love him. Billy Strings, have you heard of this guy?
No.
He's been doing covers. But Ryan did the first three covers of he did The Nothing That Is, Oh Pain, and this one. And his first cover for this one was cool, but didn't really hit the mark. And I went, listen, I said, every time this happens, he's done this twice. I come back, I give him 3 images. I said, gas masks. And I was like, I want an arch, like the Slaughterhouse-5 original cover that, Kurt Vonnegut, right? And I said, and I wanted the font to be Windsor. That was it. And I just gave him those 3 things, and then he came back with this like in a day and a half, and I went, this is immediately it. And I knew it was perfect because there's one of the characters' gloved hands is coming up over the edge of the little black part there, and I was like, that's perfect. And he doesn't know anything about the sheep lookup, so, and I wasn't actually thinking about that either, to be honest with you, but that's how that came about, and I thought that was perfect. And I told him it needed to be green and yellow too, so there's a couple of things there. But other than that, yeah. So I'm really happy with how it looked.
Well, I had a friend that asked me if my comparisons to the sheep lookup were because of the cover, and I was like, "Come on, dude, you know me better than that." The unrelenting grimness of the world is one of the things that reminded me of the sheep lookup in the text.
The last sentence is, it's Boris Says the Words is a cockeyed novel of lunatic speculative vision touched by elements of horror and science fiction, and sad, sad, sad. And that's pretty much what I wanted to get. I wrote that, by the way, but I wanted that to be it. I was not, what's funny is another Dick novel, the co-written one with Zelazny, Deus Irae, I read while I was working on a version of this many, many years ago. And I thought, man, this is going to be perfect because the description of the book sounds perfect. And that one cover, the pencil cover of the guy with the weird screwed up arms, I love that cover, was like, sounded perfect to me. That very much, though I didn't end up liking that book, I'll say that.
Yeah.
But actually, that happens a lot with Dick's books. Like, the book will not be very satisfying to me, but then like for a month, I'll just be thinking about it. And I don't know like how that works out, but it doesn't, but that one for some reason was also like this, the mood of that book and the imagery in the book and the sort of like, I always love that every Phil Dick, but when I'm talking about Phil Dick, because he was a huge influence on this novel, not just because you host a podcast about him, but like the like I said, the mood and the imagery and all those things had a huge part of what was going on here. And Valis, all the stuff that was going on in his personal life. I remember reading this, is it Sutton? Lawrence, the biography, the
Divine Vengeance,
yeah. When I read that, I was so like, I'm still really blown away by the story of him telling the doctor, no, there's something wrong with Christopher, and then like insisting, and then they find something. I mean, something was seriously wrong with Christopher, right? Like, and then they basically saved his life, according to what the book was saying. I always thought that was really nuts, and I was like, that's a form of healing in a weird way. Like, he had been almost gifted this like healing. And then when I found the epigraph to the novel, well, one of the there's 2 quotes from different ones, John Barry, and then the other one's Philip K. Dick, and the Philip Dick one's the first one, where he says, I've always told people that for each person there is a sentence, a series of words which has the power to destroy him. I realized that another sentence exists, another series of words which will heal the person. If you're lucky, you will get the second, but you can be certain of getting the first, which I thought was like, oh man. And then the rest, I was like, I'd already written this book, and then I found that, and I was like, this has to go in the front, because it's that sort of proleptic move that Dick's novels do, where like the past comes before the future comes before the past, right? There's just sort of inversion of how the timeline works. So yeah, his DNA is all shot through this thing for better or for worse. But
yeah, and
I think,
I believe me,
yeah,
look, as a Dickian, I see it. I see, this will eventually be on the Dickheads podcast as a dick-like suggestion for many reasons, but and certainly, it's no shade for me to compare it to Bruner either, because Bruner, if I was actually put, like, I think Bruner's highest highs are probably higher than, like, just speaking book wise, not anything
yeah,
else, but I think Stand on Zanzibar is the greatest science fiction novel of the 20th century, period.
yeah.
And
There was
full stop.
do you remember, before I even knew who he was? I remember when they republished that in that new version back in like early 2000, not early, maybe mid 2000s. The Millions, which is the book website.
Yeah.
I'll you read them. Yeah. I had written some things for them, and I was just like, they kept talking about that book, and I was like, what the hell is this book? Like, everybody's going to, there was a moment where it was like really hot and everyone was talking about it. And I was like, oh, this is really, but again, it sailed over my head because I didn't really understand what was going on. But I think there's a really good argument to be made for that claim that you just made, that Stand on Zanzibar is considered one of the best, if not the best SF.
Yeah. For what it did for its time and when it was, I mean, it's pretty great. Now, the comparisons, a lot of what my comparisons to Sheep Lookup have to do with the kind of visceral landscape that you created in Boris Says the Words. I think that's where it invokes a little bit of the Sheep Lookup, because one of the things about the Sheep Lookup is you cannot read that book without feeling very sad for the state of the world when you're reading it. And I had that same feeling reading Boris Says the Words. The difference in a lot of it is Boris Says the Words. So I'll stop making comparisons. Let's do that. Let's stop making comparisons to other work. Let's just talk about this book for a bit. And when I make comparisons, a lot of times it is just purely respect. It's not me throwing shade on something. It's like,
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I mean, I agree with you.
Yeah, my influences are on my sleeve too. So, but what the concept of this novel is so interesting. It's such a weird one. It touches on horror, it touches on sci-fi, it touches on Bizarro. It could be any of these things if you feel the need to promote it that way. Where did it start with? Did it start with the environment? Did it start with the characters? Like, where did this come to you at?
Started with Chekhov. It started with Pablo Chekhov. Yeah, Pablo Chekhov. I just keep saying Chekhov over and over again. I'm saying Pablo, Anton Chekhov. I don't know why I said Pablo. Because the character,
not the guy.
Because the character in the book. No, because the character in the book is named Pablo. That's why I said that. Anton Chekhov. In the Ravine, in which in the back I say I stole and trope the first line. And the first line of In the Ravine is, in the city of Uklyevo, the train line and the smokestacks of the cotton factories could be seen. And I changed it to the village of Balm slept in depression with only the crumbling TV antennas and smokestacks of the brick factory seen from the high road and the train station. That was the original first line.
Yeah.
And I changed it to
second paragraph, but yes.
Second paragraph. But I had changed it. This was a late thing. I changed it because I wanted the first sentence to be short. And and you had written this in your review, I wanted anybody who opened this book to know immediately what they were dealing with. And I will give you and you even said this too, and I have proof of this. This book is on Kindle Unlimited, which means people can read it for free if they have that program. Tons of people read The Nothing That Is, which is a short cosmic horror novella that I have. And many people read that whole thing in a day. I can see how many pages people read, right? I get like a half a cent or whatever. People start this and they finish, they only read 2 pages and they stop. And I think it's because this, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
Bohm was unmoored, and people were like, well, A, what is Bohm? Is it a person or a village? If strangers asked Pavel, who's Pavel, said it was the village, okay, maybe they'll figure that out. Was the village where cats refuse death? Now, immediately in that second sentence, people are going to have to make a decision. What did I just deal with? What am I going to have to wrestle with? Or he said it was the village where men lose fistfights to dogs, but it didn't matter. Both were true statements. So it's almost like I see your skepticism and I raise you even more lunacy, right? I wanted by the end of that first paragraph for people to know that this was not a book to be fucked with in that regard. Like, genre didn't give a shit about you. And I hope you don't give a shit about genre, because I'm just going to put it all in here. But it started with Chekhov because of that. And the original story that I had was about a guy who was, his name was just, my name's Kyle. I just used the first initial K, which I know carries all these Kafka like overtones, but I didn't care. And he was on this train. I wanted a long train ride. I had been riding a lot of Amtrak at the time, and I was just enamored with trains. And I thought, what's the longest train line in the world? And the one I came up with was the Trans-Siberian Railway, or the Oriental, one of those, right? And I was like, well, okay, perfect. Huge country, train system, do it. So I put this guy on the train, and I knew he was on there, and I knew I wanted to end the image with another sort of Chekhovian thing of like this boy in a cart being carried through this like muddy spring, and he smells wild onion. I like had all this thing in my head, right? I figured it all out. None of that stayed. There was a character early on named K that was a stand-in for me, and he dealt with Alejandro Poe, the writer. But then I realized all of my mistakes were so clear to me, so I had to like strip like half the characters out, and that changed what I needed to do, what could be done. I had to do more research. I've never been to Russia, right? I didn't go to Russia. I read a lot. I did a lot of research. I know how to research, right? I have a PhD. That's all I did was research. So I did my due diligence. I tried to get everything. I referenced all the Russian language with a Russian neighbor I had in Pittsburgh. And, I think there's a little bit of liberties that I took, but I don't think anybody should be too offended by that. Also, it's an alternative version of the present, which I should also say it's not a post-apocalyptic novel, because there is no apocalypse. That's not the point. Like, if everybody keeps saying, "Oh, it's just post-apocalyptic," I see that in reviews, but it's not that at all. It's just fucked. It's like, what if we just made all the worst decisions about nuclear energy and then didn't enforce any of the safety issues, right? And it's like, it's not like it's almost coming to pass, but Russia coming back as a power in the last like 5 to 10 years, and I can definitely see them just saying like, screw it, we're going to go with it again, we don't care, almost these types of things happening all over again.
I understand why you say you don't feel like it's a post-apocalyptic novel, but in many ways, sometimes I feel like we're living in a post-apocalyptic situation, don't even realize it.
Yeah, you're probably right.
And I think dystopia is more fair. Like eco dystopia might be more fair for this book, but I wouldn't kick that comparison too far away, because I think it's about the tone and the atmosphere. And technically, The Sheep Look Up is not a post-apocalyptic novel. It's more of an eco-dystopia, right? Yeah. But there's a feeling when you read that book of hopelessness.
Yes.
That gives it that post-apocalyptic feel. In the same way, Boris Says the Words has a feeling of just sorrow, which is funny, because that's one of the reasons why it appeals to me, is and that's why I said it's kind of a blink and you might miss it kind of thing, is you might not even realize you're looking at some of the sorrow and sadness that the characters are going through. Some of it might pass by some readers if they're, not paying. Well, I wouldn't say not paying attention. I think you're doing a sleight of hand here that's really good, in the sense of that, it's like it's almost like, look at all these horrible things that are happening, and then maybe you won't notice this horrible thing, or there's so many horrible things.
It's because so many. It is a parade of horribleness, yes, but so much of it is absurd too. But I think when you make the horror absurd, people tend to feel, oh, okay, well, I don't have to really invest too much. But it's an irregular. What's the reward system that's irregular that was Pavlov came up with? It's like when you don't always give it to them every time. It's like staggered. It's the staggered reward system. It's like every once in a while, boom, something really deep and dark and real will happen, and then it's like, like you said, if you're not catching it or if you're not paying attention, perhaps you'll just glide over it. But there is real hurt there. There's real anguish. I was given a book by the friend of mine that I was staying with when I started writing this, The Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexeyevich, which she won the Nobel some years ago. It's just an oral history of the people who fought to put out the reactor fire at Chernobyl, and the spouses of those people and the people who lived around them. And that was the most harrowing book I've ever read in my life. And I really do recommend people read it if you never have. It was once hard to get, but now it's very easy to get. But that book really, really influenced how this operated, or how this book came about. And that's the like lodestone of sadness. Is I like, okay, I'm going to do right by all these people who died horribly in this nuclear reactor fire, and then take that and try to put it through this alternative version of what would be happening if we didn't learn any of these lessons. Yeah.
Well,
glad you picked that up.
Yeah, and it's certainly first off, I want to rewind a little bit for my listeners who are used to me making spoiler warnings, and saying, like, let's go under the hood. We're kind of going under the hood a lot already, and I don't think this book can be spoiled, by the way. Because I think so much of what goes on in this book are mood, atmosphere, tone. These are things that, no matter how much we talk about them, it has to be experienced.
What about character death?
Character death, maybe we don't go into, but
remind me to tell you off air the original ending of this novel. That will add to the sadness.
Well, we could do a spoiler warning at the end, and then
okay.
But if you're my listener and you have not already paused this, gone and bought this book, read it, and come back and rejoin this conversation, it's a good way to go. But
it's a $14 well spent.
Yes, or if you're a Kindle Unlimited user, it's there. So
there.
And Pavel is one of the ways you get into the absurdity. I love the phone calls that he takes, about nuclear radiation. That's a really that's some really bleak humor.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned Deus Irae. I can see a good argument could be made that, this book does a lot of the things that you were kind of looking for in Deus Irae. Although obviously that book is far more post-apocalyptic.
Very.
It's interesting. I owe Deus Irae a lot, because I would not have written Unfinished PKD if it was not for that book. Because I went to Fullerton to find Phil's original draft of Deus Irae to figure out where he quit writing and where Roger Zelazny took over. And if I had not gone to look for that, I would not have found all the unfinished outlines and treatments and stuff. Wouldn't have written unfinished PKD. So I owe that book too.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because what I see, a lot of what I see in Boris Says the Words are, I made the comparison to like the literary skill level is something of like a Ligotti or or an Evanson, a Laird Barron, these types of writers. It's like extremely well written prose that I honestly am jealous of people's ability to write at that level. Um, I am not the wordsmith that you people are, but I think the actual prose of this book is really incredible. But what's balanced with it is the character chops. Not all those writers necessarily like write
Right.
the. I don't want to say it because they're all great writers,
Right.
but I think the character chops in here, like the characters, Pavel, um, I want to keep calling him Han, but
You can. That's his
uh,
name.
that
Alejandro Han. Yeah.
yeah, Alejandro, and then uh Boris, the title character, who's very interesting. But I think
Yeah.
Pavel was the character that I found, and it goes to such weird and interesting places. It's also like the type of thing that people who are looking for that, because it's not cosmic horror, but people are looking for that kind of neo noir that they felt missing from like the subsequent seasons of True Detective. We have like a kind of like with the folk healing of Boris and all those things, it creates this kind of atmosphere of where there's just a weird reality that comes over the entire book. So you know how do you balance character with creating that tone for you? What
So there's like you said, well, they're all great writers, and they are. I mean, Ligotti, though, I don't think Ligotti has good characters. Like
Yeah.
he's too invested in the concept and the story, and that's what people read him. I wouldn't read a Ligotti to get really great character, right? But
Yeah.
character balanced with mood and the prose was something that the characters were always there first, right? The prose was never like, again, this was the most revised book I've done, and I had lots of time to work on this. It was initially started in 2010. I didn't publish it till 2022, 2021, 22. So it had been cooking for 12 years off and on, right? And I had
Yeah.
become a much different writer over those years,
Sure.
from when I started to when I was done. And you know, part of it, and I talk about this in the back when I talk about the influences. It's like I'm a huge Dickensian and a different sort of Dick, right? A Charles Dickens fan. And Dickens, I think, is one of the great character writers of all time. He can make somebody alive who's only on the page for a paragraph or two, or maybe even a sentence. Really, he has the best flat characters, quote unquote, but also some of the best round characters. And that was something I absorbed a lot going forward. Was like making sure that the characters feel like they are people who say things that are both. It's really weird. In a novel, if you make characters just say things that anybody could say, what's the point? To some degree, right? I want a character who's going to say something I never expected before. And I remember reading an interview with Joy Williams, this author, who was like, when she realized that characters can say just the most bizarre things, that really upped the game for her. And that's what I was starting to do here. And really all that sort of prose smithing came after all the characters were established, after I felt that the characters were there. Probably also because I lived with these people, quote unquote, people in my head for a long time. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
And then it was like I was able to like revise and write the sentence in a way that was like something extra on top without making it all about the prose in the beginning, which I'm not against if people want to do that. But I don't know. I think on a very really basic, boring craft level, like I did go through at one point in time, and every page of the manuscript, I made sure that there was at least one really strong metaphor. And then I would also make sure that there was at least one sentence that I really felt was like trying to stretch the language a little bit. I didn't do it. Maybe I don't think I'm as consistent as that, but I did try to go through and make there was some sort of consistency there, because I wanted people to be able to be like, oh, wow, I really like that. I feel like I'm really chewing on something here. I'm being given something that's not what's every day, and that's hard to keep up because you have to really constantly try to like outdo yourself every page, which is tiring to say the least.
Yeah, well, you have pretty good similes in there from time to time. Although I will still give it to a local here, Cody Goodfellow, is the master of hilarious similes, and really intelligent ones sometimes. So if people haven't read Cody's work, Cody, first of all, he's got a novel coming out next year called New Tomorrows. It's going to knock everyone's doors off, but he is a master of similes. And so for me to compare your similes to Cody's is no little feat, sir, as well. But yeah, so look, I think I've made the point that I think this is a great book. That I think sir, I think you knocked it out of the park. Unfortunately, because when I read it at the time, it's probably going to be in my retro reads, because because my best of the year list, I only do like this year or the year before.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to be in there with some heavy hitters in the retros.
Well, I hope so. And thank you for bringing attention to it. I really do think that I just sort of made a sort of facile complaint yesterday online about, my most read book is The Nothing That Is, which I'm very happy about. The book has done way better than I ever thought it ever would, especially for a self-published book. But this was the book that I always wished people read more. This was the book that I always wished people would pick up and pay attention to more. So it really is it's a delight that you have found it, and that it found you, and that you think what you think about it. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I feel the same way about my novel Ring of Fire, which is also Sheep Lookup influenced. And it was nominated for the Splatterpunk Award for Best Novel. So people read it.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the sales that a lot of my other books do. And like, it's one of those things where you just look at it and you're just like, well, I wish it connected more with people, but
yeah,
it is what it is. Like the people who it does connect with, that's
strong. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So any last words you want to say about this book, as far as anything I missed that you feel is
No, if people are in any way even remotely interested in any of the things that David and I have said, please pick it up and read it. We didn't give you a plot workout because why? If you like any of the stuff we've talked about, read it. I think it is it's timely now. I think, I didn't think it would be timely, but I do think there are aspects of it that are sort of slot into the cultural landscape right now. Not that I'm happy about it, but it's sort of darkly appropriate. But
well, again, with Ring of Fire, same thing. Like every time there's wildfires, I have at least somebody saying to me like, "Hey, you wrote a book about that," and I'm like, "Yes, I know, I did." So yes, this is a dystopia that takes place in a kind of nuclear irradiated Russia, but also partially in Indiana, and it's a story that defies kind of the fabric of reality within the context of these of a cast of very interesting characters. That's the way I would put it.
Agreed.
And it's and I don't say this lightly. Kyle, it's a masterpiece. I think it's a great book.
Thank you.
It's a really incredibly strong, especially knowing that it's your first novel. I kind of hate you for that. You're this good at your first attempt. But
first full attempt, yeah.
Yeah, as a I'm not seething with jealousy at all at your abilities. But keep up the good work. What other works do you have out there, and where can people find you?
So I'm pretty much I'm not on Twitter anymore, but I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky under the handle Bleak Housing. I'll have 5 books right now. So I have The Nothing That Is, a short story collection, O Pain, Boris Says the Words. I had 2 books come out this year. In January was another novel called Grass Hands, which is SF horror. And then in September, I had a sort of side sequel to The Nothing That Is come out called Tonebone. So a character from The Nothing That Is now the focus of that book. That's another cosmic horror book. Brian Evanson gave it a really nice review, blurb, which I was very happy about. And then my next book's coming out in June 10th. It's called Enter the Peerless. It's sort of if John Ashbery and Philip K. Dick wrote a season of True Detective, kind of thing. I think the what was the thing I called it on this little piece of paper I wrote for the ad was speculative literary horror, a Midwestern True Detective meets the library at Mount Char. But I only wrote that because someone said that sounded like what it was, but I don't think that's it. I think it's much more influenced by John Ashbery, the poet, and another Phil Dick version there. So that'll be out June 10th.
Nice.
Entered the Peerless. Yeah.
Well, Kyle, keep up the fantastic work. I'm going to be catching up with some of your other work, and I'm sure people will see you here again because I will want to talk about it, I'm sure. I knew you had an Indiana connection. I did not know you were from Vincennes. That's cool. Another Hoosier doing good stuff outside of Indiana, as Kurt Vonnegut used to say. So, yeah. We're it's cool to see somebody from my home state doing such cool stuff. On that note, I hope people will find it. Boris Says the Words. It's out there. We have upcoming episodes on let's see. We've got Murray Leinster for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame coming up. First Contacts, and then we'll be doing Judith Merrill next on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame the month following. So I've got some really cool stuff planned for them. And of course, by the time this is out, if you missed by the time this is out, the Best Reads of the Year podcast will already be out. I haven't recorded it yet, but it will probably come out first. So you can backtrack, and I will be talking about Boris Says the Words on there, but also the best new releases or soon to be released books, because I got a whole bunch of arcs, especially for March coming up. And cool enough, I just got the new Ray Naylor book, but I'm waiting for next year to read it. I'm very stoked on that, and we'll be having Ray back on soon too. So speaking of Brian Evanson, we're doing an episode on Good Night, Sleep Tight very, very soon. But he's already in Europe, And so I got to do the timing with that. So keep your eye out for Brian Evanson coming back to the podcast. Should be exciting. And over on Dickheads, we're finally going to have our Radio Free Album Booth episode coming up soon. It's already recorded with Lisa Morton, who at one time adapted Radio Free Album Booth into a play. Former president of the Horror Writers Association, great short story author, and she adapted Radio Free Album Booth into a play. So that's coming up. And we also have an interview with Linda Castellini, who picked Phil up at the airport when he moved to Orange County with Tim Powers. And so you may or may not want to listen to that interview, people. Because some of it might hurt. I gotta warn you. All right, on that note, Kyle Winkler, thank you for joining us on Postcards from a Dying World, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for joining us.